Hi, everyone. Today we're going to have a conversation with John Cousens, who is the Managing Director for Public Sector Canada for Google. John has been a longtime supporter of Forward 50, and it'll be great to catch up with him and see what 2020 has done for technology in general and what Google has been building. Hi, John.
Good afternoon, Alistair. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you again. I think you were the first person I ever called about Forward 50 back in 2017 when it was just a gleam in our eye. And look where we are now, building this global thing around the world with thousands of people from dozens of countries. So it's great to be back here with you, getting ready for another one.
It's great to see how it's evolved from that first phone call into reality, and now has built its own following and its tremendous buzz around it, right? It's always exciting to come up to this time of year.
Yeah, and every year we try to do something different. So, our second year we did Circle Square, which was the big interactive thing. And then our third year, we added the Regional Digital Government Summit and took over another building. We didn't know what we were going to do this year. We had some ideas, but apparently COVID had plans for us.
Well, I must say I do miss the Cattle Castle.
Yeah, I remember the first year when we were leaving, the WWF was bringing like some pro wrestlers in. So it definitely wasn't the usual experience of sort of formal conferences at the Shaw Center. And that's one of the things we love about it is that engagement and that sort of informality. So let's talk a little about the changes that you've been through. COVID's been one heck of a year, and the government has certainly been doing a lot of remote work. And obviously, Google has not just compute infrastructure, but also a very rich suite of services, video conferencing and stuff that's helped millions of people to stay in touch. What has 2020 changed for the public sector from Google's perspective?
Well, I think what it did was there's very few things or events that really drive major transformation in government. It's a challenge, as you see in the news when you look at old projects that have been kicked around on when government has to do large scale transformation, it's challenging. But what I've seen this year is like other major events, whether it be Y2K, perhaps 9/11, where it was a forcing mechanism for governments have to reflect how they're doing things. Suddenly they had thousands of workers stranded at home and without access to the day-to-day working tools. Someone described to me the other day that a lot of government work is done on a fat client, right? They're not fully digitally enabled with cloud-based tools and services. So how do you address that? They ran out of VPN access. They had to partition it off, whether it be the federal government or provincial governments. And then they had tools that were designed in a different era. And so that's been a huge challenge.
I was reading something about the Great Depression and how it triggered the rollout of analytics in North America in a way that was absolutely unprecedented. It triggered the census because you just needed to know like how many people were actually working so you could enact economic policy. And it feels like we are in the middle of perhaps the largest social experiment of the last 50 years. We now have very hard data on everything from the carbon footprint of airplanes to how fast information can get out to how much we can ramp up healthcare systems. And when you talk about the government needing to expand internally, it's also the citizens that the government is serving that have had to change how they've interacted with the government. So how have you seen the acceleration of the sort of digital government interfaces over the last 6 months?
Well, I'll remember last March, right after everything got named a pandemic and we went into virtual lockdown Canada-wide. I had a business partner that said they were sitting with their customers using their video conferencing facilities via Google Meet just to help them hold meetings. They were suddenly dependent on other methods to get things done. There was quick adoption of alternatives. It accelerated current investments governments already had. They were going to go move down a collaboration path that allowed for this video capability internally. Some of those projects were stalled, so it accelerated and allowed people to move forward because you had a forcing mechanism. And what I'll also say, it also had an impact on the commercial sector. Canada's long been criticized, the industry, for not investing enough in technology. So suddenly everything became virtual. You have businesses with more online ordering. So Canada's been criticized for not having as much of an e-commerce presence. So it's that combination of government and industry having to change at the same time. So I think we as consumers, keeping it as a glass half full perspective, at the end of this, we'll see benefits of it because it's forced both industry and government to transform at the same time. and drive different experiences. Everyone has an app to order some food now if you're a small business in a restaurant, because that meant survival. Large businesses had to, where they had to be able to say, hey, you can have curbside pickup now, where they didn't do that before. And so that really changed. That's where I see it, from both ends of the spectrum coming together.
So Google has a lot of SaaS offerings, as you just mentioned, Meet and so on, and a lot of shared Google Docs. I mean, we've built the entire event using Google Docs in the background, and we have spreadsheets galore with hundreds of speakers on them. But there's also the compute infrastructure that powers what Google uses, but also what powers third-party stuff. And I know that cloud adoption has been relatively slow in Canada in terms of infrastructure as a service. And one of the stumbling points for that has been a consistent agreement on a secure framework for cloud computing. I know you have some announcements about that recently. What's changed about cloud computing and what public sector employees can deploy on clouds in the last few months?
Yeah, and so I'm proud to say that after some considerable effort within Google Cloud, is that we have signed a framework agreement with the federal government for protected B workloads. And what's very interesting is the government had the foresight 5 years ago to be able to pass through legislation on the floor of House of Commons to be able to extend that framework out to the broader public sector. So there's no barriers from a brokerage standpoint, for small municipalities, for healthcare, for the broader public sector to be able to access tools, whether it be Google and others, through a secure framework, and understand that where your data is going to be, and that there's the security and the policies built around that to enable that mechanism. So it really has democratized a lot of this for not just the federal government, but most jurisdictions. And so that's exciting, as one of the key CSPs and quote unquote hyperscalers, that we're be able to offer our capabilities in that market with the others.
Can you explain what a protected B is for folks that might not know that or might be in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so protected B is really a data classification that includes things like being able to process in-country social insurance numbers, data that could do harm to individuals or citizens or businesses. So being able to handle sensitive data like that in a secure fashion, where the government has reviewed this various security controls and has insight into that, and legal protections built into a contract and framework agreement, really builds the trust model. And that's what cloud is at the fundamental basis of it all. Without trust, citizens and or businesses aren't going to embrace this. And so it's table stakes, really, to have that level of security done and acknowledged. And I'm really happy to see that Canada is really caught up to the UK, the US, and we have an opportunity to leapfrog them now with that kind of adoption of these digital platforms to help us accelerate.
It does really seem like 2020 has been a perfect proving ground for the promise of cloud in two fronts. The first being that cloud is all about elasticity, and so being able to scale up usage and demand incredibly quickly, and then scale it back down when it's not needed. But the second is the resiliency, that there's no sort of single point of failure the way there is with an individual server in a basement somewhere. Particularly when people can't go in and maintain that server, like you weren't allowed to enter federal buildings for a long time. Did this kind of resiliency come into play with any of the public sector organizations you've been working with over the last few months?
Yeah, by all means. And we saw one of Canada's largest cities stand up a COVID chatbot, bringing AI in to use that machine learning capability to understand all the data that city owns, so that they could triage and help individuals who were calling that city. They built all of that themselves, and they built it remotely. None of them were in the office. So, being able to access tools and capabilities to roll technology and push solutions out like this that have impact directly on individual citizens and businesses, that's hard to do if you're living in the past paradigm of on premise and having to use different technologies internally. We saw that at the provincial level in another large province, where they're able to take that and expose some of that healthcare information, put it into kind of that digital concept, allow people to access it via an app, and using great AI tools to help take the burden off an overwhelmed system on individuals and allow it to be done through a kind of smart technology. So yeah, most definitely.
Yeah, one of the things that you keep mentioning is you keep saying municipal, federal, and provincial almost in the same sentence. And that seems kind of new to me. Like we had the Regional Digital Government Summit last year, And many of Canada's chief data officers at the territorial or provincial level had never met for the first time. In fact, they told us, like, this is the first time some of us are meeting. And we heard, and this made us pretty happy, that they then set up a monthly call to sort of catch up on things and started sharing information. And when COVID hit, they actually knew how to reach one another, which was new. And we're obviously scaling that up this year because it's virtual to bring in people from jurisdictions around the world. But how has your conversation changed? Because I mean, you cover the public sector. That's a pretty broad swath of people and organizations. How much have you seen the cooperation between different tiers of government, or different regions of government, change in COVID?
Well, firstly, Confederation wasn't designed that way to drive collaboration across east to west and amongst all three levels of government. I think one of the few forcing collaboration measures we have as Canadians is the Olympics, maybe the World Junior Hockey Championship every December, where we all come together for a common cause and cheer. For large things like we've just seen, which are national things that don't know borders, things that don't know provincial boundaries, things don't understand jurisdictional capabilities that are confusing between whether it be federal, provincial relationships around healthcare delivery, and then the local relationships that cities have with citizens that impact as well. So that isn't naturally there. Confederation wasn't designed. There's no governance for working and acting to combat this. So Google had a front row seat on that. We watched this because Google and Apple, as you know, Alistair, we co-developed the Trace API for the Trace app in Canada. So we had to deal with multiple levels of government, coast to coast. So we sat and witnessed it where there was a lack of governance. And so it was challenging to watch, where was some tension, because if you go back to my earlier comment about governance, everyone internally, whether it be in a federal department, they all want to produce the data to make their minister happy. And then you repeat that amongst provinces and then large cities. So who wants to be the one to deliver the app? They all did. And you saw a bit of conflict there until we were able to come together for the greater good. So there was no Olympics, there was no World Junior Hockey Championships to force us to do that. It took time. So I would say this has exposed how do we operate nationally from a governance mechanism when there's things like this. There's different acts for when Canada in the past has had to go to war. This is a different type of thing that could repeat itself again in the future, God forbid. How do we learn those lessons now? For those people that had never met each other when you talked about it, how do we get them to agree to what a governance framework would be for the next thing that comes at us that impacts all of us, so we can put away the borders and put away the jurisdictional differences and come together as one and cheer on Canada and deliver something substantive faster?
It does really feel like there's a desire to keep the momentum going. I was talking to Paul Glover about, how he wants to recalibrate risk. And he said something very interesting. He said, traditionally, we have always tried to solve for the risk of cost or the risk of schedule. Like, will we get this thing done by this time for this much money? But not for the risk of execution. Meaning, like, you've said it's going to take months or years to deliver this and you did it in weeks. That's good, but maybe you should stop saying it'll take months or years. And in the past, because we've always solved the equation for risk and schedule rather than solving it for execution, there's almost been this tolerance for, well, if you told me it's going to take 2 years to get there, I guess it'll take 2 years. There's been less pressure. But one of the things we discussed was this idea that digital has an undo button. So if you're building a battleship, you can't really undo the battleship and ship a new one, right? You can't update it in the field. That's very expensive. But if you've got software, you can deploy something, and if it's got a problem, you can roll it back. It's just as a matter of, updating the file servers, or you can push out a trial version and with a beta on it and stuff. It doesn't feel like the policies of legislation and the way that governance happens has gotten the memo that digital has an undo button, and therefore we need to change the calculus of risk. A little more experimentation, a little less worry about schedule and that kind of stuff. Is that something that you think people are going to get now?
Yeah, and I think it's around, you've touched on it, it's around agility. These are no longer 3, 4, 5-year projects to deliver. Once an organization understands the impact and the speed they can move, they will become addicted to delivering success. Right now, the system and the governance is built around avoiding risk, as Paul highlighted. So when everything's about avoiding risk, it elongates the entire process. But as you said, there's more of an undo button in the digital world where you can fix things and you can put out incremental capabilities. It's about speed of execution. So too much in the past, government for individuals in government was about the journey versus the destination. Now we can have a lot of small journeys and the destination and deliver faster capabilities to all Canadians. I think that's the paradigm shift here, that it changes the risk scenario too. It lowers it. In fact, I think these tools will actually help you mitigate that risk because you're going to be able to move quicker, find that fail fast first, or find that success. And once we have various organizations across Canada get addicted to that success, just watch out. Canada can now start to leapfrog some of these other digital nations that have maybe a bit of a head start on us. So that's what I'm ambitious about.
Yeah, and certainly, we had someone from Argentina last year and Estonia. They provide these examples of like universal digital identity, but they've got the population in some cases of like a Canadian city. So some of these underlying things, as you mentioned, they're a product of confederation and the fact that different jurisdictions have different tiers of identity and so on. So yeah, it's definitely, a challenge, and this has been a great reset for a lot of people. What are you most proud of in the last year in terms of the things that you and your team have been able to accomplish? I mean, other than the COVID Alert app, which is one heck of a thing to be proud of.
Yeah, our participation in that is something that everyone's pretty proud of, that we did it and it was done for free. There was no money involved. So it was a piece of technology that was co-developed that was given to the government. So for that part, we're pretty proud of that. What I'd also say is that we did a lot of things just to Google for good, to get technology in the hands of people that didn't have it. Globally, our CEO had the foresight to offer things up for free while government was struggling to buy something. And they may have bought something competitive to us, but they needed the access. So I'm proud that Google stood up and offered these capabilities and services and pushed out things like Google Meet and G Suite for people to use quickly while they're scrambling to find different ways. So that one, I'm proud of our corporate commitment to the marketplace, and also how we treated our people throughout this. The way Google let everyone work from home and that have extended that off until next year. So that's an interesting power fact. So how we helped our client base throughout Canada and around the world in public sector by giving them access to tools at no cost with no commitment. And then sincerely having a connection with the healthcare community, offering those tools and capabilities there, because it's not just big government, it's also where the rubber hits the road with the people that are actually the frontline workers, giving them access to digital tools and everything. We did a project in your hometown in Montreal with the hospital around around teleempathy is what they called it, was to use Google Meet on a Chromebook, a handheld Chromebook, so that they could access the family members from the phone and have a family conversation the way you and I are talking right now. Because people were standing at windows, people were using phones. Now you could physically see them on the other end of things. So doing stuff like that.
Yeah, and a turnkey device like a Chromebook, I mean, it's cheap enough and ubiquitous enough that you're not really worrying about sterilization. How do we get the next one out? It's not some piece of expensive gear you're wheeling from room to room. It's just a Chromebook, right? It's great.
100%.
So Google's been doing a lot of stuff in Canada, obviously standing up the COVID app and helping with that, handing out Chromebooks, giving people access to tools so they can try things out. But I understand you have a pretty big public sector event coming up in December. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Alistair. Right now, we're setting up this event the second week of December 7th to 9th, and inviting the world to it. So we have representations from JPAC, EMEA, Latin America, and Canada, and we're having different breakouts. And we have a bunch of Canadian customers that are participating in that as well. So we're opening that up so people can do sharing of best practices, lessons learned, what they've experienced in the past year, because it's been a different digital year on delivering technology and solutions within the public sector.
So we have a few days at Forward 50 structured around specific topics. The first day is on leadership. The second is the digital nations, which we're hosting this year, which is about sort of global cooperation. The third one's on public-private sector cooperation with the CIOSC. Then we have content from all the regions in the Regional Digital Government Summit. On the 9th, we have civic tech, which is sort of code for Canada, code for America. And we actually have some stuff happening on the 10th now, which we haven't really told anyone about, with One Team Gov, kind of creating this big platform for everybody to come together. Each of those, Google has like a story relevant to each of those things. We've talked a little about public-private sector cooperation, but can you talk a bit about leadership? Because it really feels like the ability to lead has changed significantly in a digital era, and that, you know, leaders who are trying to maintain maintaining their tools and their knowledge, managing distributed teams, something that Google has a lot of experience in. I mean, you have distributed offices worldwide, and you kind of got everyone addicted to OKRs and other performance metrics and so on. What do you think leaders in public sector are going to have to deal with next? Like, once we move through this, but we've all had a taste of digital, how is public sector leadership going to change?
Well, I think there's a short-term answer, because a lot of those leaders and their teams are doing what we're doing. They're remote. So how do you make it real? How do you connect as an individual, still have that level of intimacy that teams have when it's in a virtual world? And so you have to make it fun. Nobody can take it too seriously. We all have to keep a positive outlook and a sense of humor, and keep people engaged. So I think it's going to be so important for leaders to do that and recognize that what's on the other end of the camera, someone may be dealing with multiple challenges. So with COVID, you know, maybe there's somebody that was already sick in the family without COVID, and how are they having challenges getting whatever treatments they were? So you have to take, I think, right now, an extra step to have empathy and understanding of those team members, and doing that. So I think that's going to be incumbent on everyone to do that. The other piece is how do you maybe actually get them to slow down? I know I'm wearing two different sets of glasses at any given time, because I now spend more time in front of my computer than I ever did before. My kids said I should be wearing blue light glasses, because I was probably damaging my eyes, right? I never really thought of that before, but now I have two sets of glasses. So, you know, we have to look after ourselves physically, because there's also that chance where leaders may not understand. People may be burning themselves out, because it's easy to put in more because there's nothing else. If we're locked down from different activities that might have us mobile, now you're locked down here. So I think it's incumbent on leaders to understand about the mental, the physical, and the personal health of those teams at this point in time.
It's funny you mentioned that. I'm working on my opening remarks for next week, which is going to be one heck of a week, because there's also an election happening on Tuesday. And one of my opening remarks is, like, usually during Forward 50, when we send out a message, we get hundreds of autoresponders saying, "I'm sorry, I'm not in the office." Nobody said an autoresponder in months. Like, this is a very big difference, right? And so one of my opening remarks is going to be encouraging people to go set their autoresponders and actually be present and invest in learning. Because if we were in a physical space, we would have space for ourselves. If we were in a physical location, you know, that's permission to focus. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges I'm encountering. And I know our team, we're working, like, literally, I'm up until 11:30 tonight, and we were training hosts at 8:30 this morning. And it's been like that for weeks. It is so easy to just add an extra hour to your calendar, or to just accept that additional meeting, or to just have that tab open next to where you are, and not be present and not be focused on those things. How have you personally been dealing with that?
Geez, I'd like to have some days back. What I try and do now is certainly make sure I step away. But personally, I don't think I'm doing a great job. I'm an early riser, and so some days I'm in front of my computer before 6 a.m. It's a balance. It's a balance that we all have to strive for. I think right now, in the phase that we're in, is forcing yourself just to walk away. You know, if it's going to have a short drive or a walk in the neighborhood, you just have to step away from it and leave the phone behind too. We're all addicted to any kind of connectivity. So I think overall, it's about forcing that discipline.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to be sort of radically adaptive while still having a long-term vision like that. It's really hard to balance those things. One of the things that keeps us grounded is context. And I've seen these stories of governments that were using, like, an old version of Excel that only had 65,000 rows because of the file format, that was losing pandemic data and stuff. It seems like there are places where it's nice to update, and then there are places where it's like life-threatening not to update. What are you seeing in terms of the use of Google's data services? Because with things like Bigtable and more, you obviously have tremendous amounts of data in the background. Are you seeing adoption of data happening more quickly now?
Yeah, 100%, because it's driving. You're right. And there's a wonderful example that you just named about a spreadsheet that ran at a table room. And that organization thought they had it covered until they realized that. So it reminds me of Y2K, or it reminds me of the CIO that had planned for enough storage and enough compute time, but Black Friday happened and everything went down. So you'll see that because you have that elasticity into the cloud, into that burst, being able to use those platforms to do that and to have access to stuff, to surge out, to enhance and actually sort of enhance what you have and complement what you have. A lot of people think digital and cloud means I give up what I have and what I own and I lose control. It's about making the individual, the organization, much stronger by able to complement with these tools, not necessarily replace people. So that's something that sometimes gets lost in translation. There's that fear of what it will do by releasing control to something that may be automated and much better to do it. So that would be my comment on that.
For sure. So what are you hoping to get out of this year's Forward 50?
Well, for us, it's about being present. Google Cloud's a new brand in the marketplace. It's an old name, but a new brand in the marketplace that we're here. We're here to bring Google for good. We're here to make an impact and provide competition to the existing marketplace. And we're here to really help everyone on that digital transformation journey. It's an overused term, but I'll just harken back to what we've seen during COVID on that COVID app that you talk about. We're experiencing not the best adoption of the application. So my goal is to talk about this as an analogy from a great mentor of mine 25 plus years ago that said, to have adoption of technology, you have to have an exchange of value with the user. So I think, I'll use the COVID one where we haven't seen the uptake that we want. We need to focus on what is that exchange of value to the citizen to do it. Right now, it looks like it's the value is for the government wants the data. If we give them more so that it's beneficial for them, what is in it for the individual? I use that as an analogy. If we can come together that takes the boundaries of everything that all these digital services are doing, and it's all great work, now can we make sure that we understand the exchange of value that has to be there for adoption? Otherwise, some of these transformative efforts and this point in time could be lost if we don't give that exchange of value. That's my goal.
Yeah, and you're echoing something that Minister Murray said when I was talking to her earlier, that she really wants to figure out what the citizens get excited about, because unless the citizens are demanding this stuff, unless the people who are the end users are demanding this change and are excited about it, it's going to be like pushing a rope. It's going to be very hard to produce that change. Whereas I think this has definitely shown people how things are going. Well, John, it's been great catching up with you. As always, thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts for being such an ardent supporter of the event. Thrilled to be putting this on for a week of content in a year when most people are just shutting down and hiding. I love the fact that we are bringing all these different organizations under one roof to try and chart the course of digital government. And it's always great to have you along.
Well, thank you very much, Alistair. And I look forward to returning to the Cattle Castle next year.
Absolutely.